all, my name is Kenz. I hope you're doing well. And today I want to talk about foreign horror films and their American remakes. So, I'm a pretty big fan of horror movies, and I've seen a lot of different horror movies from different genres, different countries, different directors. And if you're anything like me, you might have noticed that there's a lot of American remakes of foreign horror films, and rarely are they as good as the originals. And I've always had that feeling that one is better than the other, but I've never been able to articulate why that is. So today I want to take a look at a specific foreign horror movie and its American remake and see if we can't pinpoint what really sets these two apart. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Sigaw, a Filipino horror movie, and its American remake, The Echo, both of which were directed by Laranas. Now, before we get into anything else, let me go ahead and give you a rundown of each of these movies. If you do have any interest in either of these movies, especially Sigo, I do recommend watching them and then coming back to this video. But if you don't have time to watch two movies in preparation for a YouTube video, or you would just prefer the Cliff Notes, let's go ahead and get into it. So, Sigo introduces us to a whole cast of characters. We have Marvin and his friend Pinky, we have Jude, and then we have a small family consisting of Anna and Bert and their daughter Laura. All of these characters, except for Pinky, are residents of the same floor of the apartment building that Marvin has just moved into. Marvin himself is a young man, maybe in his early 20s, and he's just moved out of his family home. Now, Pinky is not too thrilled with this. The apartment is kind of old and dilapidated, and she'd really rather just move into a nicer place together with Move-In. But Marvin is kind of dismissive of this idea. He's really just excited to be owning his own place for the first time. Jude seems to be a single man, maybe a little bit older than Marvin, who is living in his own unit a few doors down. Finally, we have Anna, Lara, and Bert, who live in a unit at the end of the hall and are kind of at the center of the conflict of this movie. Bert is a police officer as well as an abuser, which probably goes without saying given his profession, but he comes home every night suspicious that Anna has been cheating on him while he's been away all day. And invariably, this leads to some sort of beating or shouting or some other altercation that can be heard by the whole floor. To protect Lara, Anna goes to Jude for help and gets him to agree to let Lara spend the evenings in his apartment to at least shield her from Bert's abuses. Bert learns about Jude's involvement and basically warns him to mind his own business and stay out of his family's affairs. Later, Anna tries to get Jude to help her and Lara escape Bert for good, but Jude is kind of put off by Bert's earlier warning and is hesitant to help any further. But Anna is desperate, and so she spends every night knocking and pounding away at Jude's door, trying to get him to answer, but just can't seem to get himself to open the door. Meanwhile, Marvin is just trying to ignore all of this. He hears the scuffling in the halls and occasional pounding at his own door, but by the time he answers, he never finds anybody in the hallway, and he's not exactly keen to look into this any further. He also starts experiencing weirder and weirder things in his own apartment, like footsteps scurrying around, the window blinds rustling when there's no wind, and just generally seeing and hearing things around the apartment without any rational cause. He does complain to the building superintendent a few times, but he's only ever told the same thing that he's already doing, which is ignore it and mind your own business. All the while, Pinky tries to convince him to just cut his losses and move out of this place that's already causing him so much trouble, but Marvin is stubborn. He doesn't want to give up this apartment that is this first space that's truly his. And I think the movie does also mention that he owns this unit. He's not just renting, so I can imagine there's a bigger hassle involved than just like trying to break a lease. And things just keep getting weirder. Not only does the supernatural activity continue in Marvin's apartment, but even starts hearing gunshots in the hallways periodically. At this point, Marvin does decide to investigate, and eventually he gets the building superintendent to tell him the full story. Well, if at this point you do have any interest in Seago, again, I recommend you just pause this video and go watch it now because I am about to head into heavy spoiler territory, and I do think this movie is best experienced without the spoilers. So please go watch that and then come back if you care at all about this movie. If not, feel free to continue. Anyway, it's at this point the superintendent tells Marvin the truth that Anna, Lara, and Bert are already dead, and Jude moved out a long time ago. So here's the full story. When Anna knocked and begged for help at Jude's door, he never wound up answering. Ultimately, Bert killed her and Lara, and then killed himself. And Jude, unable to live with what happened right outside his door, winds up moving out of the apartment. It turns out that Marvin is living in Jude's old unit, and what he's been hearing is some sort of ghostly echo of the events of that night. And of course, learning all of this doesn't change anything, so all the while, this nightly commotion is just going on night after night. Eventually, even Pinky is caught in the crosshairs when, not knowing the full story, she ventures into the family's vacant unit and she's attacked by Bert's ghost. As much as he wanted to ignore all of this, at this point, Marvin realizes that if he wants to keep Pinky safe, he's going to need to do something. So the next time the fighting begins in the halls again, Marvin runs outside and intervenes. When he runs out into the hallway, he finds Bert and Anna fighting. Bert knows that Anna is trying to leave, and he's not going to let it happen. Originally, Bert beats and ultimately shoots Anna, and though we don't see it on screen, he does the same to Lara. But when Marvin intervenes, he's able to distract Bert long enough that Anna can grab the gun off of Bert's belt and shoot him before he can shoot her. Jude intervening and in some way changing the events of that night seems to put all of their spirits to rest, and the supernatural activity that has been plaguing him and Pinky finally stops. And after all this, Marvin is pretty ready to say goodbye to this apartment as well, and he and Pinky are able to move into a much nicer and much less haunted condo together. They move into a condo? I think it's a condo. I feel like Pinky says condo a few times, so I think they move into a condo together. But the movie doesn't end there. The movie ends with one final glimpse of Lara. We see the silhouette of her hiding under a bed, which is something she frequently did when she was alive. And I think this could easily be played as a spooky moment or like queuing up for a sequel. You know, the ghosts aren't gone. Who will they haunt next? But to me, it reads as more bittersweet than anything. You know, this cycle of violence has ended. Marvin and in some ways the ghosts are able to move on, but ultimately we can't change the past. So now that we've gotten acquainted with Sigo, let's take a look at the echo. The Echo does retain a lot of the same story beats as Sigo, but ultimately it feels like a much different movie, and you'll see why in a minute. So in The Echo, Marvin is replaced with Bobby, who is an ex convict, and he inherits the apartment of his recently deceased mother. He is replaced, and I say that pretty loosely, by Alyssa, an ex girlfriend of Bobby's. They broke up when he went away to prison, but he's trying to rekindle some kind of bond with her now that he's free again. Then we have Gina, Carly, and Walter, who replace Anna, Lara, and Bert, respectively. And if you have trouble remembering those names, that's fine. I don't think I actually knew any of those characters' names until not even the end of the movie. I didn't know their names the entire movie. I had to look it up on Wikipedia afterwards. Finally, there's not really a direct analog to Jude, which we'll talk about in a little bit more depth later. But what we do have is Bobby's mom and some other residents on this. So, like Marvin, soon after moving in, Bobby starts to hear these sounds of domestic violence in the hallways. Unlike Marvin, though, he is from the get go determined to do something about it. So each time he hears this conflict, he rushes out into the hallway, ready to do something or fight somebody, but he never finds anybody there when he wishes. But again, Bobby is determined to do something about this, and he takes it a step further from there. He even goes as far as to bang on the door of his next door neighbor, where the fighting seems to be coming from, only to be told by the man inside, Walter, to mind his own business. And again, Bobby doesn't stop here. He actually tries to call the police, but when they arrive, they find the unit empty and don't believe Bobby that there's something going on here. Along the way, like Marvin, Bobby experiences paranormal activity like seeing things, hearing things, and of course, the fighting in the hallways continues. And eventually, Bobby uncovers a very similar story to Sigo. Not too long ago, right outside Bobby's door, or Bobby's mother's door at the time, an abusive police officer killed his wife and daughter when he discovered their plans to leave him. What's worse, Bobby learns that multiple neighbors, including his own mother, knew about all of this and never did anything to help Gina and Curly. He finds out that one of the residents present during this time still lives in the building, and he goes and confronts him. He goes in on this guy. He blames and shames him for choosing not to get involved or for choosing to preserve his own safety instead of protecting Gina and Carly, who clearly needed somebody's help. Now, in this iteration of the story, the hunting doesn't just stop at spooky noises and the fighting in the hallways. The ghosts actually become angrier and more violent and wind up attacking the same neighbor that Bobby has just confronted. And this neighbor is ultimately found dead in his apartment. Now, you may be wondering where Alyssa is in all of this, since I don't think I've mentioned her yet, and the answer is not really anywhere. The presence throughout most of the movie is limited to Bobby's visits to the cafe that she works at, where he spends most of his time trying to convince her to get back together with him. His attempts at this are met most generously with hesitance, and I think more realistically with polite rejection. Now, she does conveniently serve us some exposition when she shares with a classmate about why Bobby went to prison to begin with. It turns out that he went to prison because he saved Alyssa from an attempted assault by beating the attacker to death. And if you're wondering, I bring her up now because we're honing in on the end of the movie where she finally gains some kind of plot relevance. She goes to Bobby's apartment looking for him, but what she finds is Gina running from his door back into her apartment. Alyssa makes the sound decision to follow Gina into the apartment, where she's unfortunately attacked by Walter's ghost, similar to how Pinky was by Bert. Bobby gets home as all of this is happening and promptly rescues Alyssa. And as he's getting her situated in his apartment, he hears this conflict beginning in the hallways again, and of course rushes out again to try to intervene. Similar to Marvin, Bobby watches as Walter comes home to find Gina packed up and ready to leave him. And at first, Walter appears quite confused by this, seemingly unaware of how he's mistreated his family. He tries to convince her to stay. I think he even cries a little bit, but Gina is resolved to leave, and so he flies off the handle and attacks her. And here, the scene plays out pretty similarly to how it did in Sigaw. Bobby intervenes, he distracts Walter, Gina is able to take the nightstick off of his belt to defend herself, and she actually winds up beating Walter to death with it. With this final confrontation over and this cycle of violence ended, Bobby and Gina exchange some kind of meaningful glance, some hopeful sounding music plays, and that's pretty much the end of the movie. The day is saved, the movie's over. I think it ends on a much more upbeat note than Seago did. Now that we're all caught up on what happens in these movies, I'd like to talk about some of the differences between them that I could pick up on. And I could spend all day talking about all of the minute differences between these two movies, changes in choices like sound design, lighting, cinematography, um, all sorts of different factors that all really impacted, I think, the final tone and effect of the Echo compared to Seago. But in the interest of all our time, I'd like to instead focus on what I think are some of the more substantive differences between the characters and the core messaging of each of these movies. Starting with the characters, let's talk about our main protagonists, Marvin and Bobby. We'll talk about this a lot more later, but I'll say it plainly now. I think the core messaging of Seago becomes kind of lost in the Echo, and I think the difference between these two characters is one of the biggest reasons for that. Marvin and Bobby are completely different people. It's not just a matter of Americanizing Marvin, something that I think is pretty common in a lot of these American remakes, but that these two characters are, again, just completely different people. These two characters are at very different stages of their lives with different experiences, different temperaments. They go through very different character arcs, and they have entirely different reactions, even to the entire premise of these movies. To recap, Marvin is a young man who has just moved into his first apartment, and at first is quite intent on minding his own business and ignoring all of this, even before other characters tell him to. As much as Marvin wants the fighting in the hallways to stop, he doesn't want to be the one to intervene, and he grapples with this throughout the movie, trying to balance defending his new home, keeping his girlfriend safe, and keeping his own self safe. It's only when Pinky becomes involved and is attacked by Bert's spirit that Marvin realizes that he needs to do something if he does want to keep her safe. And in intervening in this conflict that has been going on over and over again, not only does he accomplish this primary goal of protecting Pinky, but he's finally able to help put these restless spirits to rest. Through all this, he experiences quite a bit of personal growth. He realizes that minding your own business and keeping your head down is not always the best answer. He learns that keeping your community and your loved ones safe sometimes does require discomfort and having the courage to stand up for somebody who can't do so for themselves. In addition to that, I think seeing Bert and Anna's story plays out helps Marvin to recontextualize his own relationship with Pinky. At the start of the movie, he's keen to prioritize his own desires and dismiss Pinky's, but by the end of the movie, that's changed. I think initially Marvin is clinging onto this apartment as a symbol of his independence. He's moved away from his family for the first time. This is an apartment that he owns for himself, and he doesn't want to give that up initially. Over the course of the movie, he realizes that that's not the most important thing to him. And by the end, he's able to move on from that and embrace a much more collaborative and cooperative relationship with Pinky. Bobby's character arc, on the other hand, is not really compelling, and I would go as far as to say it doesn't really exist. The movie takes great pains to paint him as a character who, almost to a fault, is hardwired to act, and we see that in the reason he went to prison to begin with. And he tries multiple times from the start of the movie to intervene in this haunting. The only thing that stops him is never finding anybody in the hallways when he goes out to try to confront somebody. He also tries to get the police involved, even though they wind up being useless. And when he learns about the residents who didn't do anything to help, he confronts and condemns those people as well. Bobby is finally able to confront the spirits after Alyssa is attacked, but without the internal conflict leading up to this, like we see with Marvin, this moment really falls flat. Bobby took no journey to reach this decision. He didn't go through any kind of personal development. He didn't learn anything, didn't grow as a person, didn't challenge his perceptions of love or independence. He just kind of by happenstance finally gets to do the thing he's been trying to do the whole movie. And it's not interesting. He starts as a violent man who, for better or worse, is not afraid to stick up for others, and he ends the movie in the exact same way. course, the narrative seems to agree that Bobby is in the right, seeing as it punishes the characters who knew about this abuse and didn't do anything. That includes Bobby's mom, who is driven crazy by these vengeful spirits and ultimately dies in her apartment, as well as the other neighbor that we already talked about, who also winds up dead in his apartment. Bobby's journey through this story ultimately is just not that interesting to watch, and it doesn't say anything particularly compelling either. Now, you would think a secondary character with such importance to the main protagonists, and what I think is one of the main themes of Sigo, would be treated with a little bit more reverence in the American remake, but that is not the case. So let's go ahead and get into Alyssa and Pinky. Now, when it comes to Pinky and Alyssa, I would say that neither of them have much of a life or motivations outside of their connections to their respective love interests, main protagonists. Still, I think there are some distinctive differences between these two characters. So it is true that Pinky has few thoughts or desires that extend beyond her relationship to Marvin. We do get a glimpse into her family life and learn that her father doesn't particularly approve of Marvin, but that still comes back around to her relationship. Still, even if only in the context of her relationship with Marvin, I think throughout Seago we do get some sense of Pinky's personality. We can see that she's intuitive. She immediately senses that something is off in the apartment even before the supernatural activity begins. It seems to me that she's a decisive person from the way that she implores Marvin to get a refund and move out pretty much as soon as she hears the yelling and fighting beginning in the halls. She also knows what she wants out of her relationship with Marvin, and she's not afraid to voice it. Multiple times, she expresses her desire to move into a nicer and less creepy condo with Marvin. We also get the sense that Pinky's not particularly afraid of confrontation. At one point in the movie, she also goes to visit Marvin and finds Anna banging on his door, similar to how we talked about with Alyssa and Gina. Pinky doesn't know that Anna is a ghost and so assumes that Marvin must be cheating on her, and she wastes no time confronting him about that. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Finally, Pinky is also shown to be loyal. Even as things get weird and scary, and as much as she tries to convince Marvin to just move out and cut his losses, she does stay by his side throughout this entire ordeal. And even though this is all limited to the context of her relationship with Marvin, I think it still gives us some valuable glimpses into who Pinky is as a person. Pinky is ultimately not that much more than a tool to prop up Marvin's character growth, but we still get a sense of their bond and her general character, even if all that we learn about her is, again, through the context of her relationship with Marvin. Unfortunately, I think less can be said for Alyssa. A big part of Pinky's role in Sigo is to exemplify a healthier and more loving relationship in comparison to Bert and Anna's relationship. But I think the Echo really drops the ball on this theme in terms of how it portrays Alyssa and Bobby's relationship. First of all, at absolute best, the absolute most generously I can read this movie, Alyssa and Bobby are maybe in a situationship. I've said it before and I absolutely will say it again, but I just don't get the sense that Alyssa is particularly interested in Bobby at any point in this movie. She doesn't seem particularly receptive to Bobby's advances, and we rarely see her unless she's needed for some kind of plot point, such as acting as the catalyst for the climax of the movie when she's attacked by Walter's spirit, or giving us that sweet, sweet exposition on why Bobby went to prison. Her only other appearances in this movie are when Bobby shows up at her place of work to try and flirt and cajole her into getting back into a relationship with him, which is creepy enough on the face of it, showing up at some poor girl's work and trying to convince her to go on a date with you or be your girlfriend again. But I think this is made sadder and creepier on Bobby's part by the fact that his advances are only ever met with maybes and will sees. We really learn very little about Alyssa outside of her history with Bobby, or even really within the context of Bobby. For as little as I know about Pinky, I feel like I know next to nothing about Alyssa. We know she's a fashion student, we know she works at a diner. That is honestly all I could tell you about Alyssa. Well, maybe there's one other thing we learn. After that scene of Alyssa finding Gina pounding on Bobby's door, we do later learn that she also thinks there is some sort of other woman involved. But that feels like a pretty disingenuous plot point considering how tenuous their relationship with each other actually is. Unlike Pinky, Alyssa doesn't even directly confront Bobby about this at any point. He actually learns about it secondhand from a classmate of hers who she's somehow told about all this, even though she did follow Gina into her apartment directly after encountering her. So I don't know when she shot off that text, but at some point she did. And that seems to be kind of a core of Alyssa's character in this movie is she's kind of passive and indirect. She won't directly reject Bobby, she doesn't directly confront Bobby, and again, she's only really present when the narrative requires her to be so. I can accept Pinky as a character even if she's not one of the best written ones. I can identify a few personality traits. She voices some of her own desires. She even takes the initiative and has the agency to show up to Marvin's apartment on her own a few times, which is not something we really get out of Alyssa. And so it feels like Alyssa truly is nothing more than an accessory to Bobby. At this point, I feel like we're starting to maybe see some patterns in how these characters have been translated over to the Echo, but let's go ahead and take a look at Anna and Lara and Gina and Carly, the mother and daughter duos of each of these movies. So, all four of these characters are necessarily people with no agency, given the fact that in both versions, they are already dead and just replaying the final moments of their lives over and over again. Even when their stories do kind of change, it's only made possible through Marvin and Bobby's interference, not through any actions that they've been able to independently take for themselves. So the way these characters are presented differs pretty dramatically between Sigaw and the Echo. I think Anna and Lara of Sigaw are depicted much more sympathetically, even in the ways that their spirits haunt Marvin. Neither want to harm him or are trying to scare him. They're just scared themselves and looking for help. I don't even get the sense that they realize they're dead. When Laura runs around Marvin's apartment, as freaky as it is, and I also would be freaked out by it, it's because during her life, that's where she found refuge from Bert's abuse. And when Anna runs up and down the hallways banging on doors, she's not trying to be a jerk or trying to scare anybody, but she's desperately looking for help. In both cases, Marvin is not being targeted intentionally or maliciously. He just happens to inhabit a key space in all this since he's living in the apartment that used to be Jude's. On the other hand, it seems to me like Gina and Carly have been almost literally demonized, made to resemble the types of malicious entities you would see in movies like The Conjuring or Insidious. She seems mainly to exist to scare Bobby and at times even just us, since sometimes the scares occur over Bobby's shoulder or someplace else where he can't see it, but we can. Even in moments where she's just scurrying around Bobby's apartment, similar to how Laura did in Marvin's, I think it's framed very differently in The Echo than it was in Sigo. In Sigo, I think it's framed with much more mystery and apprehension, whereas in The Echo, I think it is framed as something much more frightening and insidious rather than just the scared little girl that she is. Moreover, like we've touched on, these ghosts become violent. Obviously, Bert and Walter are aggressors in either film, but the people targeted by the ghost's violence in this movie, outside of Alyssa, are the neighbors who did nothing to help Gina and Carly. And given that, I get the sense that we're to understand it's Gina and Carly terrorizing these neighbors, since I don't think it makes sense for Walter to be the one doing this. While in Seago, no deaths occur except for Anna's, Lara's, and Bert's. And at no point do I get the sense that Anna and Lara are trying to punish anybody for having not done enough. Again, they're only ever echoing those final moments of their lives where they were trying to avoid their ultimate demise. Speaking of Bert and Walter, let's take a look at them next. At first, I kind of worried that Bert received the opposite treatment of Anna and Lara. If Anna and Lara became demons in the form of Gina and Carly, it seemed to me that Bert's image as this violent patriarch seemed to be softened to that of Walter's, this guy that seems oblivious to even being an abuser. So in Seago, Bert is portrayed as a pretty unambiguously awful person. He's a jealous and abusive father and husband who is pretty intentionally cruel and intimidating to the people around him. He berates Anna just for imagining her infidelity. He physically abuses Anna and Laura both, and he intimidates Jude when he senses that Jude is trying to help them. In the Echo, when Walter finds Gina about to leave, he's confused. He seems not to understand what he could have possibly done to make his family want to leave him, and it's only when Gina stands firm in this decision to leave that he ultimately becomes violent and winds up killing his family. Now, I think you could read this in a couple of ways. On the surface, I think it can feel like the Echo is trying to absolve Walter of some responsibility for what he's done by portraying him as this unwitting guy who doesn't understand what he's done wrong. On the other hand, I think the scene can serve to portray how insidious some abusers can be. Sure, he might come off as a soft spoken guy, but the fact that he immediately escalates to violence when it's clear that he's not going to get his way is very telling of his true nature. So when I first saw this movie, I did kind of lean towards that former viewing of that absolution of responsibility for this abuse. And I think that is still a valid argument in some different ways. But I have also come to appreciate that this could be a more nuanced take on abusers. Because, yes, some abusers are like Bert. They're always at 100. They're unapologetically violent and shitty to everybody around them. But I think there are just as many abusers who are more like Walter, who on the surface appear soft spoken, especially in the presence of others, but are quick to escalate when, again, they realize that the nice guy act is not going to work for them. So I think it's a change made that comes with some pros and some cons, but is perhaps one of the more thoughtful changes that they made in the Echo. Now, I do want to talk about Jude for a moment, and I think he's one of the most interesting characters in Sigo, but it's a little more difficult to draw connections between his role in Sigo and the Echo because he doesn't really exist to the same extent in the Echo. So instead, we're going to talk about some of the roles and ideas that Jude exemplifies in Sigo and how those wind up appearing in the Echo. I think if Marvin comes to represent somebody who stands up and intervenes in defense of someone else, even at the risk of his own safety, Jude winds up representing kind of the opposite. He occupied Marvin's apartment before him, and he witnessed all of this firsthand when it unfolded. And like Marvin, he struggled with the decision of whether to help and stand up for Anna and Lara, or whether to mind his own business, like Bert has told him to do. Jude clearly wants to help and had helped by letting Lara stay in his apartment before, but in those final moments when Bert is about to slay his family, Jude can't seem to bring himself to open the door and potentially put himself in harm's way to help these people that honestly he barely knows. And that's the end of Jude's involvement in all of this. He's able to move out of the apartment and move on with his life, and he's not materially affected by his role in all of this. Yes, he will have to live with the emotional consequences of what he did or didn't do in that moment, but it's not like he's being held responsible for these people's deaths. And I think the message of Jude's role in Sigo is pretty clear. We may have no obligations officially to our neighbors and our community members. It's not like Jude was required to do anything in this situation. But how do we live with the emotional weight of choosing not to do anything? Jude is not punished for his choices in any material or judicial or other sense, but he is affected and changed by them. So, how does all of this nuance and complexity come across in the Echo? Unfortunately, I would say not particularly well. I loved Seago. I think it presents these ideas really beautifully and with a keen awareness of the kind of gray spaces present in this kind of situation, whereas the Echo strips it down to a pretty black and white, right or wrong decision. So Jude, as this former neighbor who chose not to act, is not represented in the Echo by any one character, but instead by Bobby's mother and every other resident on that floor who did not help Gina and Carly. And multiple of these characters are punished either by the ghosts or their own conscience, and they ultimately wind up dying. Personally, I really dislike the choice to spread this aspect of Jude across multiple characters. Where Seago presented the complex and unique struggle that Jude faced in his specific role in this story, the Echo kind of generalizes it into the story about the bystander effect, where now we have a bunch of people who chose not to act, perhaps because they thought somebody else might. And the whole thing goes from intimate and complicated to broad and vague. And as a result, I think the Echo becomes a lot less impactful. So now that we have a good understanding of these characters and their roles in either story, let's turn to some of the main themes of Sigo and how they appear in the Echo. So to me, there are a couple of core ideas in Sigo. First, it emphasizes the difference between love and abuse through the two relationships that we see on screen. Bert and Anna are obviously in an abusive relationship, and sadly, she and Laura face the worst possible outcome of that. Marvin and Pinky, on the other hand, while not a perfect couple, are a much better example of a healthier and loving relationship. They do have some disagreement, like whether Marvin should stay or move out, but it's ultimately Marvin's love for Pinky and his care for her well being that inspires him to take the actions he ultimately does. Overall, Seiko does a pretty good job of getting these ideas across, especially considering Marvin and Pinky are pretty firmly a couple throughout this movie and demonstrate genuine love and concern for each other. Pinky does urge Marvin to move out when things start getting weird, but she's also there for him when he insists on staying, and I think both of those are motivated by her love and connection with him. And when she sees Anna outside of Marvin's door and worries that he's cheating on her, her reaction is much different than the kind of reaction we see from Bert when he assumes similar out of Anna. Well, of course, Pinky is hurt by the idea that Marvin might be cheating on her. Her first instinct is not to assault, berate, attack Marvin, but to just talk to him about it. And it's obviously important to Marvin to protect Pinky from the escalating supernatural activity that's taking place. As we've discussed, it's Bert attacking Pinky that shows Marvin that he needs to do something before things escalate even further. It's why Marvin even has this final confrontation with Bert, which enables Anna to end the cycle of violence and abuse that her ghost has been forced to endure night after night. And this caring relationship between Marvin and Pinky obviously juxtaposes the relationship between Bert and Anna, which is defined by anger, mistrust, and violence. And we do see some similar threads with Bobby and Alyssa in the Echo, but again, it doesn't really work considering they're not really a couple throughout this movie. So, as we know, Alyssa is eventually attacked by Walter's ghost, and Bobby has to step in to save her. Unfortunately, this doesn't really hit as hard considering Alyssa has been so lukewarm to Bobby this whole movie, and considering that Bobby has been trying to do this the entire movie, regardless of Alyssa's involvement or presence. Because of this, the Echo's messaging just comes off kind of weak and empty. Even accepting the premise that these two are a couple, which I don't, but pretending that I do, Alyssa is not present or involved in Bobby's life nearly to the extent that Pinky is in Vince. There's no concern for Bobby living in this building. There's no discussion of their future together. There's nothing really to demonstrate their bond or commitment to one another. And the couple that we're comparing them against in this movie doesn't really stack up either. Walter and Gina's relationship receives very little screen time, so we don't get as keen a sense of their dynamic as we do with Bert and Anna. I didn't even know these characters' names through most of this story, let alone any details of their relationship. On the other hand, Sigaw lets us in on Bert and Anna's dynamic, and we actually get multiple scenes showing the cruelty that Bert displays towards his family. I think the only time that we even see Gina face to face in the Echo is during the climax when he comes home to find her leaving. And based on that, we do understand their relationship to be abusive. That's not how a normal man who loves his family acts. But the Echo really doesn't give us much more than that to judge their relationship by. And because neither relationship is portrayed with much depth, it weakens this message of the difference between a man who loves his partner, like Marvin, and a man who only wants to control them, like Bert. Another theme Seago explores is the question of what we do when we see some injustice in our community, such as a neighbor facing domestic abuse. Do we potentially put ourselves in danger to intervene, or do we do as we're told when others tell us to mind our own business? And what I love about Seago is that it explores both answers to this question relatively non judgmentally. Duke makes the choice to preserve his own safety, or at least does not actively choose to help Anna and Laura. And while that does result in their deaths, the movie doesn't particularly punish him for this, except for him now having to live with the natural consequences of his decision. Marvin, though he does choose to intervene, is also not unnaturally rewarded for his choice. He does save Pinky, and because of that, their relationship becomes that much stronger. But I think that also is a very organic consequence of his choice. The consequences, good or bad, that these characters face is administered by simple cause and effect, and not something so blatant as being haunted to death. Ultimately, Seago is not setting out to tell us what is right or wrong, but instead asks us to consider what we might do in a situation like this. Further, I think it also examines some of what motivates us in that decision. For example, Jude has no one to look out for except himself, and so it may feel like the easier or more natural choice to continue to do that. In Marvin's case, though, he's not acting in his own interest, or really even in the interest of Anna and Laura, but instead is motivated by this desire to protect Pinky. So I think not only does Seago ask us to consider what we would do in a situation like this, but also how our interpersonal connections or relationships inform that decision. And the echo falls flat here too, because as we've already discussed, the narrative does punish what it deems to be the wrong decision. Those tenants that did not act wind up dying. Meanwhile, while I don't think Bobby is unnaturally rewarded for how he acts, I think the movie also doesn't make a particular effort to examine his character or his choices. Even Alyssa defends Bobby's criminal conviction, asserting that he was only trying to help. And the end result winds up being this movie that very simply says, helping people good, not helping people bad. And it completely ignores the nuance that Seago so thoughtfully explored. Now, I think there are certainly other threads in the Echo that you could pick up and play with and find some meaning in, but as compared to Seago, that movie totally feels flat for me. So that's about all I have to say about Seago and the Echo. If after watching this you have any interest in watching either or both of these movies, I definitely encourage you to do so. Even knowing the twist, Seago is a great watch, and even The Echo is a fairly competent supernatural horror movie in its own way. So if you're interested, definitely give those a watch and let me know what you thought in the comments down below. If you have any other thoughts too, whether about this video or other American horror remakes, I'd love to hear them. And of course, if you liked this video, I would love for you to hit the like button, and please subscribe if you're interested in seeing my future videos. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you sticking with me for this long, and I hope you have a good day. Bye!